Hey there, this is Kamal, and in this video we're going to carry on with what we were learning in the previous video about JavaScript. So let's get this started. Alright, so in the previous video we've seen how we can actually include JavaScript inside our HTML page. For that we used the script tag. And apart from that we also created a main.js file wherein we've seen some of the basic things that you need to know when it comes to JavaScript. So in that video, the last concept that we had learned was functions. So we had created a function called as test and we gave it something. So we created a function called as test, and inside that we had a console.log statement, and we actually executed that particular function using this statement. So this is one way of actually creating a function. Apart from this, there's also another way of creating a function, and that is through the arrow operator. So in order to create that, what we have to do is that first we have to type in a constant. So it's going to be a variable. So let's say I'll give it as test2. That is equated to a parentheses, and after that we give out an arrow. So arrow is going to be equal to and a greater than symbol. Then we give out curly braces. So this itself is a function with the name of test2, right? So we can call this particular function by typing in test2, and that's going to work. So like let's say if I give it a console.log statement here, as you can see here, we are currently inside the arrow function, and right now when I execute this particular function, this statement is being executed. So similar to how we had actually passed the data here, in this case as well we can pass the data. Like let's say I can give it as Kamal, and if I take a variable here and if I use that variable, I can output it here, right? So in this way you can use the arrow functions as well, like arrow operator, to create a function, and this could be called or said to be as the arrow representation of a normal function, right? So this is actually, a bit more easy to do because this will be quite useful in some cases as well. So remember that we have something like this. All right. Now let's remove this from here. We don't need it anymore. All right. Now let's actually see how we can actually create object literals inside of JavaScript. So let me first quickly create an object and explain to you how that is done. So this object literal is something that we generally use in order to store or access data, right? So it's similar to an array, but instead of actually using, a normal array format, we use something else. So I'll quickly give an example to you and explain that. Okay, so now we've created an object. So an object is nothing but a collection of key value pairs. And in this case, the keys are going to be name, age, and likes coding, and the values are Kamal, 21, and true. So you can think of that like an array as well. So let's see if I have a test array. So let's say I have an array called as test array. So if I open this out, you can see that inside of this, you can think of 0, 1, and 2 as keys and 1, 2, and a as values, right? So this is how you represent that. And when it comes to an object, you have name, age, and likes coding, which actually function as an ID, and they are called as keys, and these are the values associated to that particular key. So similar to how you access a value inside of an array, so you type out the ID, right? Similarly, if you want to access an object as well, you can do that. Here I'll type out the test object. In that, if let's say I want to access name, what I'll do is that I'll give a brackets. In that, I'll give the name of the key. So that's going to be name. If I do that, you'll see that Kamal is being printed, right? So in this way, you can access the values present inside of an object by typing in its name, right? This is one way of typing in its name. The second way is going to be, let's say, dot name. So you can either use the dot operator or you can go with the square bracket as well, right? So let me say for in this case, I'll be using the dot operator. One more thing that you need to keep in mind is that if you want, you can add quotations to the keys as well, right? So if you give it as quotations here, and even if you save that, that's going to work just fine. But when you create a JavaScript object, we don't give it as quotations, but even if you do so, it's not going to, have any issues. Alright, so now we have seen how we can actually create an object and also access the data present inside the object. And we have seen that three types, that is string, number, and boolean. Apart from that, if you want, you can also create an array. So let's say I have a key with called as skills, and if I want, I can create an array of multiple values as well. So let's say I want as HTML, CSS, JS. If you want, you can have a number as well, just for keepsake. So this will actually create an array. Now let's say I want to access the values present inside of skills. So for that, I can type in skills. If I save that, I'll have the array. Now if I want to access an element inside of this particular array, I can type in a square bracket. In that I can give the ID of whichever element that I want to access. Like let's say if I give it as 1, that should print out CSS, right? If I save this, you'll see that CSS is being printed, right? So in this way, you can actually create an array inside of an object as well. So that is one way of creating an object. So if let's say I want to create multiple objects instead of a single object, the way that we can do that is by, let's copy this first. So what I'll do is that instead of starting it out as curly braces, I'll start it with a square bracket. So I'm creating an array. Now inside this array, I can create objects, right? So if I do it like this, I'll have an object with these particular key value pairs. Right? So now that is an object present inside of an array. If I want, I can have multiple objects as well instead of a single object. And let's change this to something else. Right. So now I have an array of 3 objects. Each of these objects have an ID of 0, 1, and 2. Right. Now let's say if I want to access the elements here. So let me remove one object from here. Yeah, you'll be able to see this now. So let me say I want to access the second object. So what I'll do is that I'll start out with the test object. Now since this is an array, I'll have to give the ID of whichever element that I want to access. Now in this case, I want to access the second element, right? So it's going to be 0 and 1. So for this, I'll give it as 1. Now I have access to this complete object. If I save that, you'll see that the object is being printed. Now if I want to access an element inside of this particular object, I can give it as, let's say, name, and that should give me the value of name. If I want to access an array which is present inside of this object, like skills, I can type it as skills. Then inside that array, I want to give the value of HTML. So it's going to be 0. If I save that, that's going to give me HTML. So in this way, you can also access an array consisting of multiple objects, right? So this will be quite useful when you're trying to create a dummy backend for our Angular project, right? So at that point, we'll be using this a lot. So it's better to remember this, all right? So now let's remove this and let's carry on. All right, so now let's start with learning the DOM. So it's going to be DOM, which stands for Document Object Model, right? So in order to actually understand the Document Object Model, let me first explain a few things. So now if I console log something called as window, you'll see that we have an output here saying that window. So this window that you're seeing here is actually the object which actually defines the whole JavaScript of our website. So this window is the place through which the whole logic starts from, right? So now the console.log that you're actually using, or the alert that you're using, so we have this, right, alert. This alert is actually part of the window object, right? If I, let's say, if I give it as alert, that's going to create an alert, right? But the normal syntax that we normally follow is that it's going to be window.alert. That's actually going to create an alert. But the thing is that since window is a top level element and it's like the parent of everything, even if we don't give it out like this, automatically the alert will be created. The console.log is also the same thing. If I give it as window.console.log, it's going to work just fine. And even without that, it's going to work just fine, right? So this window is the parent object in which all the elements are present inside of our JavaScript. So anything that you're actually using is actually part of the window object. Along with these alert and console.log, we also have another element inside of the window object called as document. So this document object represents our current website or the current web page, right? So this web page that you're seeing here is a document, right? So this document object is something that we use to access the elements present inside the web page. That is the elements present inside the body and everything else, right? So anything that is present inside the HTML page, if you want to access that, you have to use this document object. That's why this is known as the document object model, right? By using the DOM, you can actually interact with the index.html page. That is, by using the document, you can interact with the HTML page. So now before going further with this, let's actually create some dummy content inside the index.html page. So about this, I'll create a form. So now inside this form, let's add an input tag. So this input tag is going to be for, let's say, username. So let's create another one, which is going to be for password. Below that, let's create a button, submit. So now as you can see, we have a form. Apart from this, let's also create a text area. Alright, so now in order to actually interact with any of these elements through the JavaScript, what you can do is that you can use the document object, and inside that we have a method called as query selector. So I can type that in, and inside this I can type in any HTML element that I want. Like let's say I want to access the form. I can type in form. Now let's console log this thing. So I'll console log. If I save that, you'll see, yeah, I forgot to give quotations. So you have to give it as quotations here. So it's going to be inside of quotations. Now if I save that, you'll see that we have an element or an object being printed in the console. So if I, maximize this, you'll see there are a lot of properties, right? So all of these properties actually link to the form element that we have inside our page. So this represents the input tag 1, this represents the input tag 2, this represents the button, and so on and so forth, right? So this contains whole of our data regarding our form, right? So in this way, you can access any element present inside your HTML section. Apart from that, if you want to, let's say, select a particular element, then what we do is that instead of using this query selector, we use an ID, right? So if I go back here and if I give an ID here, like let's say I'll give an ID to this called as login form. Similarly, let's give an ID to this input tag as well. Alright, so what I've done is that I've given the IDs to these 3 elements. Now let's go back to the main.js file. Inside this, instead of giving it as form directly, I can actually type in a hash which represents the ID, and I can type in login-form. If I save that, you'll have the exact same output. But if I want, now I can actually access the username as well. I can type in hash username, and if I say that, I can access the input element, right? So using this, you can access any element inside your page. Apart from that, if you want, you can give a class name as well, and you can access the class. But class is not preferred, and that is because classes are not unique. That's why we use IDs, because IDs are unique, right? So if a particular element has an ID of username, then no other element can have that same ID, right? That's why this will be useful. So we generally use this query selector to select anything that we want, right? So apart from this, we also have something else called as get element by ID. Now if I save this, inside this I can give out the ID of whatever element that I want. Like let's say in this case I want to type in the password. If I save that, you'll have the input field called as password. But the one thing that you have to observe here is that we don't use the hash symbol because we're directly trying to get the ID, right? So it knows that this is an ID. Previously we used the query selector, which was actually searching for an element which has an ID of username, right? So that's why we had to use a hash. In this case, we don't need that anymore. Apart from this, we also have get element by class name, and we also have get element by tag name and normal name, right? So if you want, you can use this as well. So here you can give a class name, and if you save that, you'll get the class name, but we don't have any element with that name, right? So let me remove that. Alright, so now let's say I want to access some data which is actually typed into the input box, right? So let's say I type it here as Kamal. Now I want to actually access this particular data inside of our JavaScript. The way that we can do that is by first accessing the element, right? So we have the element here, right? You have the element. So let me remove this password. It's not. Let's go with username, right? So instead of console logging it directly, what I'll do is that I'll assign this particular thing to a variable. So now what I've done is that I've linked this particular element to a variable called as username. Now I can actually use this username to actually get anything related to this particular element, right? So if I want, I can type in console.log. Inside that I can type in the username dot value. Once I do that, as you can see, we are able to get the data that is present inside of this into this, right? So if I type in something else, and once I refresh the page, you'll see that we have the data inside this particular section, right? Similarly, if you want, you can get the data from this as well, and similarly from the text area. Okay, so now we're able to get the data from the HTML page into JavaScript. Now let's see how we can send the data and place it inside this particular input tag, right? So what I'll do is that instead of console logging that, I'll actually assign some value to it, right? So if I do it like this, username.value is equal to, let's say, hello. Once I save that, you'll see that this particular value is being set into the value field of this username input tag, right? Now you'll see hello. If I give it as something else, and if I save that, that will be added to the input field, right? So in this way, you can add any kind of data to any element that you want. Apart from this, if you want to add some data to not just form element, but let's say a heading or a paragraph, then the way that we can do that is by, let's create a heading here. I'll give it an ID called as main-heading. Now let's go back to the main.js and let's create another constant with heading, and let's give it as main hyphen heading. If I say that, I'll have the value accessed through the heading variable. Now let's remove this from here and let's add it as heading dot inner text, which is equal to, let's say, hi. If I say that, you'll see that below this text area we have an element which is h1 and it has data called as hi. If I give it something else, if I save that, you'll see that that data is being updated. So that is one way of adding text, but the main problem with this is that this will only add textual data. If I want to add, like, let's say a HTML, we cannot use this. Instead, we use inner HTML. Now inside this heading, if I want, I can create an anchor tag. So let me start it out with double quotations. Inside this, I can write it as a. Click me. Now this will have a href attribute, right? So one thing that you have to keep in mind is that if you want to have quotations inside of quotations, then you need to use alternate quotations. Meaning that if you have double quotes at the start and at the end, then in between you should use single quotations, right? Now I can redirect it to any place that I want. And if I save that, you'll see that you'll have a link inside of a heading. If you go to the inspector as well, so let me maximize this. Let's go to the inspector. And if you hover over this, you'll see that we have a link present inside of the heading h1, right? So in this way, you can actually add data to the HTML directly by using inner HTML or inner text, or just directly doing it through dot value for the form elements. Now let's see how we can actually change the styling of this particular element, right? So let me remove this from here. Let's add hi. So we can use inner.html for anything that we want. So in this case, I'll just add HTML as well as textual data. Now let's say I want to change some properties regarding this heading. So I can type in heading.style, which is another property associated with a particular element. Now inside that, let's say I want to change the background color. So I can type in it as background and I can assign it something, like let's say I'll give it as red. If I say that, you'll see that a red color background has been added to this particular h1, right? So in this way, you can actually change any styling property that you want for a particular element. So you have to actually create that element first by using this ID. You'll have that in the variable, then you can apply any property that you want to that particular heading or that particular element. So if you want, you can use a hex code here as well. And apart from background, you also have some other properties. So you can search to this and add in any property that you want. So now let's say, instead of actually, giving it as red color as soon as the page loads, I want to, actually make this more dynamic, and I want to, click on a button, and when I click on that button, this particular red color has to be added. In order to do that, we need to use what are called as events, right? So that button click is considered to be an event, right? So whenever you click on that button, something else has to happen. So that is an event. So in order to create that, what we do is that let's remove this from here. So now I'll also remove this. Instead, I'll add the data directly here. If you want, you can do it through JavaScript as well. So we have the data. Now let's add a button here. And it's a normal button, it's not a submission button. So let me say change color. And in order to actually create an event, we use the event name. And in this case, it's going to be click, right? So on click. So that is an event. Apart from that, we also have on DBL click, which is double click. So if you want, you can actually search for the events that we generally use inside of JavaScript as well. But for this video, we'll be using only two events, one of which is on click. So now I'll equate that to, let's say, a function. So if you want, you can directly type in the JavaScript code here, but I don't want to do that. Instead, I'll, actually call a function whenever that button is clicked. So let's say I'll give the function name as change color. Now we need to actually create this function, right? So let's go back to main.js. And inside here, let's create that function. Inside this, what I'll do is that I'll take the heading and I'll take the style property from that and I'll add the background color to it, which is going to be, let's say, red. So now what's happening here is that whenever I click on this change color, automatically red color is being applied to this. That is because whenever I click on this button, automatically this change color function is being called, and that actually executes this statement which changes the style of the heading, right? So in that way, the control flow is happening. But the main problem here is that this gets, a lot complex if you add in multiple properties, because right now you're able to change only one property at a time. But let's say you want to change 5-10 properties at the same time. Then in that case, this is not the optimal solution. So instead, what we do is that instead of changing the style property directly, instead we change the class, right? So what we do is that we generally create a style.css file, and in that style.css file we'll have a class with some properties, right? And whenever this button is clicked, instead of adding the property directly, we'll add a class to this particular thing, right? So I can do that by going to the class list. So every element inside of a HTML page has a class list. Now inside that class list, I can add an element, which is going to be, let's say, bg-danger, which is a Bootstrap class, though we don't have it right now. If you had Bootstrap connect, then it would have worked, right? So what we're doing is that either we can use a Bootstrap class or a custom class which we have inside our own style sheet, and whenever this button is clicked, I want to add that class to this particular heading. So now if I go back to this page, and if I go to the inspector element, if I click on this particular h1, you'll see that there's a class called as bg-danger which was applied, right? So if I refresh this page, you'll see that by default there is no class here, but if I click on this, a class is being applied. Now this class can be connected to anything that you want. If it was a custom class, then that custom styling properties would have been applied, but since this is a Bootstrap class, the Bootstrap properties will be applied, but we don't have the Bootstrap in our project, so that's why we are not able to see the output. But that's how you can actually add class, and a class could contain any number of properties that you want. So the final thing that we're going to see in this video is going to be the form submission. So we've seen how we can actually call on events and change some properties based on that event, right? So now let's say you want to actually submit this data, and whenever this submit button is clicked, you want to get this data directly, right? So the process is similar. So what we do is that we actually add, so let me remove this text area, we don't require it here. Then I'll give it an on-click event, which is going to be equated to submit form. So now what I want to happen is that when I click on this particular button, the form has to be submitted, right? So let me remove this from here. Let's select everything and let's remove this completely. Now let's create the function. So it's going to be submit form, and in that I want to get the data of the username and password, right? So I'll directly output the data for now. So in this case, it's going to be console.log. Then that let's take the document dot get element by id, and the id in this case is going to be username, and we want to access the value property of that username, right? So it's going to be value. If I save that, it's dot value. If I save that, you'll see that whenever I click on the submit button, the page is being refreshed, but if I go to the console.log, you'll see that there's nothing here, and that is because this data is actually being taken and it is being submitted, and that's why we are not able to see the output. So if you want to see the output, what we have to do is that we have to prevent this default form submission, and we have to make the form wait unless and until we submit the form manually through JavaScript, right? So it's going to wait till all those functions have been executed. Then if we say that it can execute, then it's going to carry on forward. So in order to do that, this is not the practical way to actually apply it. So instead of using it as on click, what we do is that there's another event called as on submit. So I can go to the form tag here and I can give it as on submit. I'll equate that to, let's say, the submit form. Now if I save that, you'll see that the same thing is happening, but even now we are not able to actually prevent the default action that is happening. So in order to prevent that, what we do is that we pass in an event variable. So this event is actually present inside of every form element. So whenever you call the onSubmit event, the event variable will contain some data regarding this event that is happening. So you don't need to actually define it explicitly, that is there by default. So I'll be passing that event to the submit form, and in the main.js file, I'll take that event inside of a variable called as event here. If you want, you can give it as E for shortcut. Then inside the function, I can type it as e dot prevent default. If I save that, you'll see that whenever I click on submit, the page is not refreshing, right? So if we didn't have the prevent default action here, and if I clicked on submit, you'll see that the page is refreshing. But now if I do it like this, you'll see that the page is not being submitted. So that means that this page is actually waiting for the JavaScript to actually tell it that it can submit. So if I want, I can type in something here, and if I click on submit, that data will be showcased here. So in this way, you can access the username and also the password. Once you get that, you can process that and do whatever you want. And once you're happy with that, you can submit the form. So in order to submit the form, what we have to do is that create another variable and we link that to the form that we had created. So my form actually has a data regarding the login form. Now I can type in my form.submit. If I save that, you'll see that once I click on submit, that is being submitted. So that means that if you have this, the form will be submitted. So what's happening here is that we are getting the data, we are preventing the default action, then we are processing that and we're actually typing it something here. And then if I add this line, that will be submitted. But if I remove this, it's not going to be submitted and it's going to wait for the JavaScript to say that it can submit, right? So in this way, you can actually get the data from any form that you want, and then you can process that, and then you can send that data to any server anywhere in the world. So in that way, you can actually get any kind of data from any HTML element, and you can process that and you can do whatever you want. So using this, you can make animations, color effects, and whatever you want. So now we're done with the basic things that you need to know in JavaScript in order to get started with Angular. So from the next videos, we'll see how we can actually, create some projects using Angular. So that's what we'll be covering in the upcoming videos. Alright, so before closing this off, I just wanted to say that this video was made in collaboration with packetcode. So packetcode is a training and placement company located in Hyderabad. And these videos were specifically made for the job guarantee training program that they have going on right now. And that is the full stack Java developer program. So apart from these free video lectures, they also have some premium content as well, like lecture notes, practice and test papers for you to get better at your core concepts. And they also have offline as well as online classes for this program. And they also conduct multiple demo sessions as well. So you can attend any of these demo sessions and understand the things they are teaching as well as their training approach firsthand. So if you're interested, I provided the website link in the description down below. You can go there and check them out. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you have liked what you've seen till now. If you did, then please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.